Welcome back to our video series on the Pingji Romanization for Cantonese. This video's lesson will be about tones. So what exactly are tones? Well, to answer that, we also need to know what pitch is. Pitch is like pitching an instrument. You can have high pitch and then low pitch. Pitch can convey a lot of meaning in a lot of languages. For example, in English, I'm going to use different variations of the sentence, "This is fine." When we usually speak a normal sentence in a standard American accent, we use a relatively flat pitch with a subtle drop-off in pitch at the end. Did you notice how when I said at the end, my pitch lowered? So if I were to say "this is fine," you can hear that little drop at the end. Or some people raise their pitch at the end in the sentences too, like in the Valley Girl accent. "This is fine?" That's within normal variation. But if you really raise your pitch, like "this is fine," then you're asking a question. If you sharply drop your pitch, that's an exclamation, usually conveying anger or impatience. "This is fine." Or you could end a sentence with a flat, low pitch throughout, like "this is fine," to kind of express hesitation or sadness. But these aren't tones per se. Technically, it's more intonation that allows us to convey mood and intention with subtle changes to what you overall want to convey. Tones, on the other hand, are how you change your pitch within each and every syllable, such that that tone completely changes the meaning of the word, just like how replacing one consonant or vowel can change a word into something completely different. For example, a very common example used to illustrate tonal languages is in Mandarin, where the tone you use for the sound ma may make the difference between mom and a horse, which is something that really can't happen in English. And that's why it's really important that we pronounce these correctly then, right? In Cantonese, we have 6 different tones. I don't want to overwhelm you with this graph, but it's just to give you an overall picture of how these tones look. You see for each of the 6 tones how the pitch changes over time. One important takeaway from this picture is that most of the tones, except for the red and blue ones, actually start with a low pitch, which is a very important fact that Pingji takes advantage of. Here's another much more simplified graph showing each of the 6 tones separately. Again, there's no need to memorize this now. I'll be going over each one in detail separately. One important thing I want to highlight here though is the wording they use. High pitch is the high point of one's vocal range, where low pitch is the low point of one's vocal range. This means your normal, comfortable speaking range. Unless you need to emphasize something, you don't need to strain your voice. Think about the English examples I gave. You don't need to squeak your voice to ask a question, right? So I'll give you an example of my vocal range. Highest, lowest, highest, lowest. So how will Pingji represent tones without accent marks or numbers? Well, let's go back to the basics. Let's ignore tones for a second. Fundamentally, how does the Latin alphabet work? We don't just randomly throw letters together, right? They're in chronological order from left to right. So let's look at this word, sam. We pronounce the S first, then the A, and then the left to right chronologically. Sam. It makes sense, right? Now we're going to introduce a y-axis to this graph, pitch. You've already seen it earlier this video with those graphs. If we really want to be clever, we could have 2D words. Like this would mean a rising pitch, sam. That's really cool and all, but also incredibly impractical for obvious reasons. We're going to stick to a single flat line like most sane writing systems do in this planet. But this time we're going to employ a trick. The trick is that as you read a word from left to right, you will assume lowest pitch. And I can't stress that enough. Assume lowest pitch as you read the word. The moment you come into a special tone letter, that tells you when to change the pitch. Do you change it right from the start, or do you change it at the end, like how we ask questions in English? Well, let's put this into practice. Let's say we add a letter to the beginning of the word, this letter H, which is right after the initial consonant. This came so early that we now know to start high right away. So instead of sam, we have sam. And because the change happened early, we just hold the pitch at the same level throughout. Sam. So here's a different word. Now in this case, we add that same letter after the vowel, so already relatively near the end of the word. This tells you to raise the pitch later indicating a tone that starts low and then goes high by the time you finish the word. So this is sam, sam. See how this works? And then here we have an example of a tone letter coming at the very end, meaning you only raise your pitch as you're getting to the end of the word. So this one is sam, some. Kind of like the last example, but more subtle of a change. This tone letter came so late that I didn't even have time to raise my pitch high enough as I got to the end of the word anyways. So hopefully you can see that there's a logic to where the tone letter is placed within a word. I've already given you a little sneak preview into the letters like the H and Z, so one thing you might ask is, isn't it very disruptive to have these letters mixed into the word? Well, my answer is, think of them as silent letters, but silent letters that have a lot of purpose to them. Now, where in the world have we seen people use a language of such an abundance of silent letters? Oh, wait. That's right. French is notorious for silent letters. For example, the French phrase from which we get RSVP, répondez s'il vous plaît, has all these silent letters, which are colored here in green. Think of Pingji as French writing, but with a lot more meaning behind those silent letters. And actually, two of the silent letters here, both the S and the Z, are also tone letters in Pingji. Alright, so now we know what tones are, and that Pingji is going to tackle them using silent letters where their position in the word matters. Let's finally learn the tones. Our first tone is the high flat tone, which is a great example. This tone starts high at the upper end of your normal range and stays high. The way you pronounce the tone is fairly simple. It's just high flat like this, as if you were a robot. Now, the letter for this is actually just an apostrophe. It's very convenient because the apostrophe is a marker that's written at the very top, right? So it's a huge visual clue to keep your pitch high. The apostrophe always comes at the very beginning of a word too. Remember how in Pingji you assume you start at the lowest pitch? Well, this apostrophe from the very beginning tells you to never start low. We're starting high and ending high. If you've noticed from the example earlier in this lesson, the other letter to represent tone 1 is the letter H. Now the reason for this is if it were only apostrophes, there would be an abundance of apostrophes all over the place, which could look like quite a mess. So the solution is to use the letter H in front of certain consonants where it doesn't look so intrusive. Why the H? Because it's one of the few letters that reaches the highest point a letter can reach. This symbolizes the highest pitch contour. And finally, you can see in the schematic below, the H has to come after the initial consonant, not at the very beginning of the word. Now, what letters look good with H? They're going to be S, C, and Z. Mainly because these letter combos are also often seen in Mandarin Pinyin, so it's nice to keep things similar in the same family of languages. But I can't stress this enough, these sounds don't make the sounds sh, ch, or j. None of those sounds exist in Cantonese. They're merely the sounds sa, ta, and da, but starting at a high pitch. We also have a fourth, WH, thanks to it being pretty common in English, so why not? Let's look at some examples here, and this is also the first time where I can finally show you what full Pingji words actually look like. Si, tat, zao, wan. Those were examples of the 4 consonants that get an H. For everything else, here are some more examples. Remember, these use the apostrophe at the front. Ma, yat, bak, Feel free to repeat these words to yourself to practice the tone before moving on to the next one. Next, we'll do the second tone. This one is the high rising tone. This is another fairly simple one. And it's as if you're sharply asking a question, like, what? Yes? Hello? Once again, we use the letter H for the same reason as before. The tall vertical stroke of the lowercase letter tells us to go really high. Since we start low but end high, our tone letter comes later, specifically after the vowel. So let's do some more examples. Here are 4 extremely common words. 喺嗰水上. Feel free to pause and practice the first couple tones before we move on. Next we have the third tone now, which is mid-flat. The way to think about this tone is as if you're on a phone but bored and just kind of automatically answering, yeah, okay, just kind of in the middle of your vocal range. This is represented by the letter R, which makes its first appearance in Pingji, making it one of the only pure tone letters. We use R because the shape of the letter only goes to middle height, where it has a relatively flat top. As for its position, we put it right after the vowel. This is the only tone letter that deviates from the principle of putting the letter earlier in the word if the pitch is not low. In this case, it comes closer to the end. Hopefully you read the R and the vowels at the same time, which should clue you in to start at the mid-pitch and keep it flat throughout. And here are some examples. Go, ma, fun, dong, and an. A notable point here for the words in red is that the A in those words are still the long A because they're considered the end of the word, at least the non-tonal component. You treat the R as an invisible letter. It's not a final consonant. So you see how in AARN you write out the two A's because you have the final consonant N, but for AR, there is no final consonant. So you can just write it as a single A, but they both make the same ah sound. Ah versus an. Alright, so moving on, our next tone is number 4, which is the low falling tone, and the only tone in Cantonese that actually drops in pitch, which also makes it the lowest tone. So again, this one starts low and drops a little lower. Since I've been doing comparison to English, this is kind of like the American English default pitch for normal sentences. We tend to drop the pitch as we get to the end of our sentence. So, like this. It's subtle, but it's definitely not flat. Now, as for the tone letter, we use the letter S. And once again, this has everything to do with its shape. It has a mildly curved ceiling and a mildly curved floor. And between the ceiling and floor, going from left to right, there is a downward slope. This symbolizes the downward fall in tone. So once again, the letter is a big visual clue to the tone. And so for this tone, the letter S comes at the very end of the word. Here are some examples. Ma. Once again, this is a long A sound because the vowel is considered the phonetic end of the word. Next is loi, then tao, and then finally yun. Now I'm going to do something different for tone 5. Before explaining what the tone even is, I'm going to show you the tone letter, which is a Z. It also comes at the end of the word. Can you guess how this tone works? Well, if you notice, it's exactly like the last tone, but the Z faces the opposite direction. There are again 2 flat lines representing the ceiling and the floor, and this is connected by a line going up from left to right, which makes this a low rising tone. So what exactly is a low rising tone, and how do you separate it from the high rising tone that we covered earlier? Have you ever talked to someone who always ends their sentences like a question? Like they talk like this? Or maybe you're that kind of person? Well, that's basically the tone. When compared to the high rising tone, it's much gentler. More like a huh? Rather than a huh? Which is the high rising tone. And so here are some examples. We have yet another ma. This time it's ma, meaning horse. The next 3 are the basic personal pronouns for I, you, and he, she, it. They are ngo, ne, and kai. So again, feel free to pause and go back and practice the last couple tones by yourself before moving on to the final tone. So our final tone is the 6th tone. The tone itself is rather simple, but the spelling rules are more involved for this one. We've had high flat, mid flat, and now we have low flat. Low, like this, at the lower end of your natural pitch range. It's not too common of a tone in English. The only example I can think of right now is if you see a really cute animal, and one thing you might want to say is, "Oh, it's so cute." The last part is the sixth tone. Low and flat. Cute. You don't have to deepen your voice by an octave or anything crazy. Our tone letter for this is the J. It has a very nice low curve that dips below the floor to symbolize the low tone. And the special rule for J is that it comes at the end of a word, but only for words that end with a vowel. So what if there is a final consonant? Well, S and Z can look reasonable at the end of a word thanks to some influence from European languages like English and French. The J after a consonant just doesn't look as natural. So instead we need to do something different to represent the low tone when there is a consonant there. Not only that, it'll also depend on the type of consonant. Can you recall what those 6 ending consonants are? I'll give you a few seconds to recall before moving on. Remember that there are 2 types of ending consonants. The stops, represented by P, T, and K. And then there are the nasals, represented by M, N, and Q. Each of them have their own rules for spelling the 6th tone. We'll start with the stops. Remember when I was discussing final consonants in the consonant lesson? At that point, I was saying the letters B, D, and G kind of convey a dragging sense, like in English. For example, compare pup versus pub. See that dragging when I say pub? Well, if we take that sense of dragging and instead use these letters to represent the low, flat tone, then that works too, right? So, for example, pub, bud, bug. So, that's all it is for flat tone words that end with a stop. You replace the final stop with its unaspirated equivalent. So to make that crystal clear, P turns into B, T turns into D, and K turns into G. These letters are unique because they're the only letters in Pingji that convey both sound and tone at the same time. Now, let's look at the nasals. Here we're going to do the same thing, drag them out. So to convey that feeling, let's just simply add another N as our tone letter. For the final consonant N, that's really easy, because it just means 2 N's. How about for the other 2? Well, for M, we're going to put an M at the end. Just think of the English words damn or him. They both use M followed by a silent N. And then finally for the letter Q. Would the N also look fine being placed after the Q? Not really. But if we put the N before the Q, it looks very natural, and it literally almost looks like the good old combination of NG. So there you go. Our final rule for this tone is all nasals get an extra N, which goes at the end except for Q, where it slides just in front of it instead. Alright, let's put all this into practice now. I have 4 words here. How do you make tone 6 the low flat tone? I'll give you a few seconds to try for each word before moving on. Good for you if you got it. The first word is probably the most important word you can learn in Cantonese. Hai, which means to be. So get used to seeing that a lot. Hai. Next is sat. Then yut. And then finally, bak. All of them are extremely common words. Here are some more words, including our obligatory ma word. How do you change these to the 6th tone, or the low flat tone? I'll give you a few seconds to figure it out. Good for you if you got it. First we have ma, then yong, some, and finally, mun. Here's a summary of all the tones. Feel free to pause if you need to review. Remember that we have 3 flat tones, 2 types of rising tones, and 1 falling tone. It's also only the flat tones that have variant spelling rules. And that's it for this video. Because tones will be a foreign concept for most of you, I'm splitting the practice portion into its own separate video. So instead of practicing at the end of this video, try to prepare by listening to and speaking the tones that we reviewed in this lesson. We'll see you in the next one.